Hi, this is Sandra from Sand Recycled, and I am going to show you how to make a simple, just decorative tray. You're using items that you can find at the Habitat for Humanity Restore. So the first thing that you're going to want to find is a piece of tile. This is rectangular, depending on the size and shape of your tray. Just pick a tile that you like and that will suit your size. You are also going to need some wood. Now I'm using pallet wood. They have a great supply of long pieces of boards. I would suggest nothing bigger than a 1x4, which is actually 3/4 of an inch by 3.5 inches. That would work well. You just need a piece long enough that is going to trim your tray. So the wood is going to be the sides of the tray. Now you need something for the bottom of the tray. I have a piece of plywood here. You could also use other boards, whatever you can find. And we're going to make little feet for the bottom, and I'm just going to use the same pieces of wood that I'm going to use for the trim around the outside of the tray. You're going to need some handles, and there's a couple different kinds of handles. So this type of handle here, you actually need to drill into the wood both to sink these tabs and then also for the screw to go into. So this would be probably the most complicated type of handle that you would get. You can also get ones that just need a hole through the wood, and from the inside of the box you would screw into the handle. Or these, which would be the easiest. So this kind here, you do not need to have a drill. The holes are on the outside, so you would just use small screws, and from the outside of the box just screw right into the box to attach your handles. So those are pretty much your supplies. You are going to need nails. You want them long enough that it's going to go through your wood and into the other wood, but not so long that it's going to poke through anything. These are, you're also going to need a tape measure, but these are 1.5 inches. I would say 1 inch would also be fine. This wood that I'm using is only about 1/2 inch thick, so 1 inch nail would be sufficient, but this is what I have. You're going to need a hammer for the nails, and you will most likely need a screwdriver depending on how you're going to attach your handles. I already said tape measure. You can also just use a ruler if you don't have a tape measure. This one is actually a square, which I love, but just a regular ruler would be fine. I have a miter saw, an electric saw, which is going to make things a lot easier for me, but if you don't, you can just use a handheld saw. You're going to need some wood glue. Most likely you'll need some sandpaper. My wood is pretty old, so I am definitely going to need to sand this wood. Now, in my case, I have an electric sander, and like I said, my wood is really pretty nasty, so I'm going to use my electric sander, and I will probably use an 80 grit sandpaper, and then I'll use a 100 and then a 220 grit sandpaper. If you're using nice new wood that you get at the Restore, you probably will just need a little piece of sandpaper just to kind of clean up the edges from where you have cut. 220 grit would be just fine. I also have an electric drill, not necessary unless you are using the pulls that need a hole. So I've got my drill and drill bits. Depending on what you want to do to the wood on the outside, you might want to paint it. Since I love the look of the pallet wood, I'm just going to give it a clear coat. And this is just a matte finish clear coat spray dries really quick. You don't really notice it, but it does give that layer of protection. Like I said, you can also just use, you know, your favorite color of paint. I believe that's all the supplies that I need, so let's get started. So the first thing you're going to need to do is to measure your tile. And you want to be really accurate with this, or else your tile is not going to fit. Now, of course, my tile is not a normal size. Usually they're even numbers, like maybe an 8 by 12 or something like that. But this is actually 8 5/8 by 15 1/8. Now you might want to write those numbers down so that when you go to cut your wood, you have the numbers precise. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my piece of plywood to fit the bottom of my tile. So I want it to be exactly the same size. If anything, just a hair larger. If you make it too small, your tile is not going to fit inside. So I might bump it up 1/16 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, just so that, like I said, so that your tile will fit inside. I'm gonna go cut my piece of wood, and then I'll be back. So I do have a table saw, and I just cut this down. If you don't have a table saw, just measure out your piece onto the plywood and make sure that it's square, and then just use a handsaw to cut it out and try to be as straight as you can. Sand the edges so that they're smooth. Double check to make sure that it's just the right size. So I'm putting my piece of stone on here, and there's just a little bit of extra space, and that's what we need. So the next thing that we need to do is to measure for the surround pieces. So when we cut these pieces, we're going to have 2 pieces that are the exact same length as the wood below, and then 2 pieces for the sides, but they are going to be a little bit longer depending on the thickness of your wood. So if you're using like a 1 by 4 and your wood is 3/4 of an inch thick, you're going to need the length of your base board piece plus 3/4 of an inch plus 3/4 of an inch, which is 1.5 inches, and then that is going to be the length that you need for your side pieces. So then you're just going to cut those, and while you're at it, you're going to cut 4 pieces for the underside of the tray. Now, this is not necessary. I like it because it just gives a little bit more height and not quite so much depth on your tray. But that's up to you. So depending on the size of the piece of the wood, if you want to put little feet under there, you can, but like I said, not necessary. So I'm going to go cut those pieces of wood to do the frame, and I'm going to use my miter saw, but again, you can just use, and again, this is why I like this, because it will give you a perfectly square line, and then just use your handsaw. So I cut my 4 sides, and while I was at it, I cut my 4 feet. I just want to make sure that everything is going to fit before you start putting it together. So we know that these are my ends, and then these are my sides. And you're just going to kind of dry fit this to make sure that everything was cut properly. looks good. So I'm going to take this outside and sand the wood. Obviously, if you're using new wood that is not all dirty and crusty, you can pretty much skip this step. Just like I had mentioned, when you're cutting wood, it tends to get, let's see if I can find a good example, you know, a little rough in the corner, so you might just want to sand that smooth. But this all needs some serious sanding. And so I'm going to go outside. When you're sanding, you should always wear hearing protection, maybe a dust mask. Goggles would be good as well. Again, the downside of using pallet wood is that it takes a long time to sand everything down. I don't know if you noticed how brown, gray, dirty these were, but I still leave a little bit of the texture because I like it, but they're sanded down nice and smooth, no more splinters. Now I am going to, and I also sanded my feet, so now I'm going to attach my feet to the bottom of my piece of plywood, and I am just going to use wood glue. I'm actually going to use my nail gun because that will make my process a lot easier and quicker. If you don't have a nail gun, which most people don't, just put a good amount of wood glue on the bottom of the feet and let the glue thoroughly dry before you move on to the next step so that they don't fall off. So I think I'm going to use this as my bottom, and I'm just going to put a good amount of glue onto my feet. And then put them right in the corners. Just square them up right, and you want it flush with the corners of your plywood. Again, if you're not doing this step, then just ignore me. And like I said, you'll just have a deeper tray depending on the size of wood that you're using. There's lots of different kinds of wood glue out there. I've been using this Titebond for many years. I really like it. You can just, get it at your hardware store. If a little bit of glue seeps out, I don't really like to see that, so just clean that up with your finger. You don't want so much glue that it oozes everywhere, but you want plenty that it makes a good bond. Okay, so just let this dry and we'll move on to our next step. My feet are attached with my nail gun. Again, I don't expect that you're gonna have a nail gun. I do a lot of building of furniture and accessories, and the nail gun is, it's amazing. If you ever decide to start building a lot of furniture, accessories, frames, whatever, yeah, a lot of times on Black Friday, they'll have a great sale where you can pick up a nail gun with a small compressor for $99, and no, I have not hammered a nail and I can't tell you how long. But for those of you that do not have a nail gun, you are going to have to use a hammer and nails. And so you're just going to put your pieces on here and line them up and then nail them. Now, the other thing I like about adding the feet is that there's more to nail into. You could use a thicker piece of plywood. That would work perfect. If you found at the store maybe just like a 1/2 inch piece of plywood, that would really make the nailing process a lot easier, and you really wouldn't need to worry about adding feet. I don't have any thicker plywood right now. I just use this thin piece, so I had to add the feet. So one thing when you are nailing two parts together, it's so much easier to start your nail when it's laying down. So I would say 2 nails are going to be more than efficient. So if you just take and think about how thick your wood is and put your nail halfway between that distance. Actually, I might do 3 nails, 2 into the board and 1 into the base. So you just start your nail. Ooh. That's pretty loud. And then you're going to turn your baseboard sideways and your piece here. Line everything up. And you could add a little bit of glue before this step too. Okay, and then you're just gonna hammer it together. You're gonna continue this process until all 4 sides are put together. My box is all nailed together now. And at this point, you would paint it or spray it or wherever finish you're going to do for the box. So I am, like I said, just going to use this clear spray because I love the way the wood looks, especially with this piece of tile. If, like I said, if you want to paint it, go ahead and do so. You do not need to paint the bottom because of course your tile is going to be there, but you're going to want to go ahead and paint the inside. I would do it now because then you don't have to go around anything being in the way. My box is all dry. Well, dry enough. It started raining, so I had to bring it in. And now it's time to attach the handles. So again, this type of handle here requires a screw to go from the inside of the box through the side into the handle. Now these screws come in different lengths. You just want to make sure that you have one long enough but not too long. So you want it to be able to go through your wood and go into your handle. So one way to check that would be to screw that all the way in and then just hold it to the edge of your wood and make sure that it's going to go through the wood and into the handle. If you're going to go that route, you will need to drill 2 holes. So you'll find the center, well, for any of these type of handles, you're going to need to find the center. So my box is about 9 7/8. Might want to get your calculator for that one. So once you find the center, then you'll measure the distance between the holes. So this specific handle is 3.5 inches. So then you would just measure 1 3/4 inches, 1 3/4 inches, figure out how high you want it, and then drill your pilot holes. One trick for figuring out what size hole you need is if you take the screw and remove some of your pieces, the screw needs to be able to fit down in to where the drill bit was, so you'll know that that's big enough. You don't want to make the hole too small because if you're not precise, you won't have the holes lined up. So if you make the hole just a little bit bigger, then it gives you a little bit of wiggle room. So for these, like a 3/16 inch bit would work just fine. And you're going to drill through either way, this way or this way. Probably easier to drill from this side here. And you'll drill through, and then you'll put the screws through the hole, put your handle lined up with the holes, and then just use your screwdriver and tighten the screws into the handle. So that would be one way. This one here, like I had mentioned before, you need to countersink. This would not work for mine because my wood is not thick enough. It would work if you're using like a 1x4. Like I said, this part here needs to counterset into your wood. So what you would do is you'd need to figure out how big of a hole this is, but don't drill that size hole all the way through your wood. These are definitely not the type of handles for beginners. Like I had mentioned before, the easiest typed handle would be the kind that just goes right on the outside of the box. The one thing you need to make sure is that the screws you get are the right size, and I think that these will work, although they're not the color I thought they were. I might have to paint them once I'm done. So you want to make sure that the head of the screw is big enough that it doesn't go all the way through, but that the screw itself does go through. And then you want to make sure that it's not so long that it's going to poke through your wood. These are borderline. They almost go through to my wood, but I think that they will work just fine. So it'll be easiest to set it on its side like this. Again, find center. Sometimes it's easiest to work backwards. This is almost 10 inches, which would be 5 inch, and then it's less 1/4 of an inch almost. So that would be less 1/8 of an inch. So 4 7/8 is my center. So I'm just gonna put a tiny line there. And then I'm going to figure out how far, just visually figure out how far I want my handles to be. And I'm just gonna mark these holes with my pencil. You can measure just to make sure that they are level. I'm pretty good at eyeballing it. And just make a little dot in the center of those holes. Now, you don't need to do this next step, but it does make life a lot easier, and that is to pre-drill a pilot hole for those screws to go in. So I'm just going to do that here real quick. Just going to line that up. Now these screws have just a standard head, so I'm just going to use a standard screwdriver to put that in. Getting a screw started can be really challenging. That's again why drilling a pilot hole makes it so much easier. Probably just go back with a little black paint or something. And you can always spray paint these screws beforehand. And if you find hardware that you really like the design of that hardware, but the color is not quite right, you can always spray paint it. there we go. I've got that on. Like I said, it did poke through maybe a 32nd of an inch, but I'm not gonna worry too much about that. I can always just take a little sandpaper and sand that down. Put both handles on, and then you're just going to set your piece. Pray that it fits. Down in place. There you have it. An awesome little serving tray. One thing that you could do, if you have clear silicone caulk, you could just go along that inside edge just to form a seal so that it keeps any crumbs, any dust out from that little, I mean, there is just a hair of space. That's all I needed, just enough to make sure that the tile goes inside. And then you're all done. Thank you very much. Hope everyone's being safe and healthy during this time. I appreciate you watching this video. And again, all these supplies can be found at the Habitat for Humanity Restore. Thank you.